In chapter 27, the plot keeps chugging along. Beaufort's collapse creates a financial panic and a social scandal. He is married, of course, to a distant cousin, not that distant, of the of May's family. So he is very much embedded in that world, and this world had been going along with him for quite some time. Even if he seemed a little bit flashy for them, he was making everybody a lot of money. He was fitting in well and throwing the fancy parties, so they were all happy to go along. But now things are going south and pressure is rising. Mrs. Mingott has a stroke after her niece or whatever, after Beaufort's wife, the relative, goes to see her and basically beg her to, well, let's just stick together on this. And the scandal supposedly is too much for Grandma Mingott, and she has a stroke. So one thing after the other starts happening in the plot. The drama is building. Ellen Olenska is summoned from Washington. The family decides that they have to send for her to come up because the condition of Grandma is so precarious right now. And it is, of all people, Archer is sent to telegram with the news. Chapter 28, more family fretting about the financial scandal and the continuing presence of Ellen in their lives. Newland has volunteered to go meet Olenska's train as it gets into New Jersey and escort her to her grandmother's house. May points out that, well, you're not even going to be here because you're going to be on your way to Washington for that big business meeting or whatever. And he, of course, tells a very awkward lie that she sees through, or at least appears to. She seems to be asking some leading questions and just making a point of these things. And you can see how maybe she's not the innocent little girl so much anymore. She has learned to be a very watchful and judgmental, but a largely tacit power within Newland's life, within their little social scene, as a microcosm of the larger New York social scene. And she is, in her own little way, squelching the kind of independence that he has always rather prized and valued in himself, apart from the pezzo davanti, let's say, of New York high society. When we get to chapter 29, Newland is going to meet her, and we get this lovely little passage about about how he has heard that there are plans for a tunnel from Lower Manhattan into New Jersey, and oh my gosh, wouldn't that be something? And he starts spinning out these little things of and maybe one day there will be flying machines or a boat, a ship that can cross the Atlantic in 5 days or so, and all of these seemingly absurd wonders of the 1870s that, from the vantage point of the 1920s, Wharton is able to imagine quite clearly because they exist. So there is that little dislocation right at the beginning of the chapter that suggests that there's a construction here. There is an artifice here. You're being reminded, as readers, you're being reminded that this is just a book. This is just a sketch. You are not inside this reality. This is all an objectified artifice, which is interesting right at the start of this particular chapter, because this is when Newland and Ellen have another one of their big meetings, these little tentpole events throughout the novel, where we get this high drama, and we are reminded right at the offset that, well, yeah, this is all kind of fake. But the actual mechanism of viewing the art is called into question in a very modernist way. We are constantly reminded throughout this chapter of how little we can trust our senses, particularly our sense of sight. The scene is very dark. It is snowing. It's very hard to get much of a sense of what things really are. And it's that is augmented by the fact that Archer is largely fantasizing so much through his way. He's living out some sort of ideal dream, and it very rarely actually matches up with the reality. He is on his way there. He's envisioning this grand scene of meeting her on the train platform in a kind of ideal vision of romanticism. But when he actually meets her, those ideals aren't really met. He barely recognizes her. He has conjured an image in her mind. He hasn't seen her in some time now. He's conjured an image in his mind that is at some odds with reality. But that motif of hampered vision is struck again and again and again throughout this chapter. Everything is shadowy and indistinct. At one point, we're even told that Archer was, quote, watching her profile grow indistinct against the snow-streaked dust beyond the window. It's always hard for him to see. See physically, see with his mind's eye. Is he physically clouded because of a lack of light, or is it obscured or opaque because he is trying to see through his own blinders of idealism? The talk they have is considerably opaque as well. Readers aren't even privy to the first few words. It's just oddly kept at a distance. You would expect that a grand scene like this, you get those first words, but that is not really the case. The scene is very hard for us to see as well. The conversation is implied more than anything. It sort of unpeels through these levels of conventional chit-chat that we've seen again and again. In this case, greeting until they can maybe warm up to address these matters that are between them. After that, it all happened as he had dreamed. He helped her into the brougham with her bags and had afterward the vague recollection of having properly reassured her about her grandmother and given her a summary of the Beaufort situation. He was struck by the softness of her. Poor Regina. Meanwhile, the carriage had worked its way out of the coil about the station, and they were crawling down the slippery incline to the wharf, menaced by the swaying coal carts, bewildered horses, disheveled express wagons, and an empty hearse. Ah, that hearse! She shut her eyes as it passed and clutched at Archer's hand. If only it doesn't mean poor Granny. A lot going on in that little passage. The physical progression of the journey kind of matches the slow progression of their conversation. They are slowly easing into the reality of it. The symbolic significance of the hearse prompts the beginning of their dialogue, the dialogue to which we are privy. It is notably Ellen who initiates it. Her concern for her grandmother is her primary concern, but it's also a way of ignoring what is his primary concern, which is the undercurrent of their illicit connection, their unspoken love at this point, unspoken, at this moment. Their talk, though, even when they start talking, when they start exchanging, is similarly confused. They kind of talk past one another. They don't seem to connect. They confirm a few of the plot points, and it's about her past with Monsieur Riviere. They allude to the mythical figure of the Gorgon as a very significant significant metaphor for themselves. But it's sort of clunky in a conversation. For reading, it strikes something as somebody as being very literary. It is, after all, a literary reference, and Wharton just sort of sticks it in there, and it feels artificial. It doesn't feel like real talk at that point. But of course, nothing between them ever is real talk. It is all somewhat performative. It is all essentially literary. This is a book. Wharton is hitting us over the head with, this is a book. This kind of tiresome, stale symbol of literature and literary discourse and classical references. It seems false. Again, that sense of falseness is drilled down upon. At one point, he pines wistfully for the opportunity to run away from it all, to get away somewhere where nobody would be judging them and they can live together, and a fantasy. She torpedoes that almost immediately from her much more experienced perspective. She is an experienced woman of the world. Again, the value that Wharton kind of held for herself when she was writing it. But Ellen is a woman who has seen a bit of the world. She has lived in other parts of the world. She has seen things. She's got some battle scars, and he really does not. He's kind of a goofy neophyte. He's might think of himself as very worldly, as men tend to, but he really doesn't know much at all. And so she points out that, well, people are kind of the same wherever you go. This, of course, is a basic tenet of realism. Whereas he was pining for the romantic vision, she counters that with realism, which is that people cannot escape their circumstances. Society is always the controlling factor in the dynamic with the individuals, and the individual is always ultimately crushed by society. This is basic aesthetic history 101. At one point they share a kiss, but even that is sort of hard to notice. You can skip over it really easily when you're reading down the page. The act is essentially buried in the scene. She says, "You ought not to have come today," she said in an altered voice, and suddenly she turned, flung her arms about him, and pressed her lips to his. At the same moment, the carriage began to move, and a gas lamp at the head of the slip flashed its light into the window. She drew away, and they sat silent and motionless while the brougham struggled through the congestion of characters about the ferry landing. Note the progress of the carriage back to New York interrupts their embrace. They are getting closer to New York. So there's all sorts of symbolic value there. Light also intercedes. This is the moment when light shines into the carriage. I'm not sure, again, how much light there's going to be on this boat, on this ferry, but sure, light suddenly bursts in. Very symbolic. The congestion of carriages that we are told about also crowds the image. You get this grand romantic moment between the two of them, and you want to see it in close-up, but instead we are pulled back, and it is just sort of jostled around. It's just one more little element in a very busy composition of people going places and doing things that have nothing to do with them and don't really care about them. They are within the society that he is dying to escape, but she knows is largely inescapable. Even the way the kiss is described is not as a kiss. We are told she presses his lips to her lips to his. Is that a kiss? I don't know. We're not told. The physical reality of that action is right there and it is observable, but what makes it a kiss? Well, that's something a little bit more perhaps subjective, a little bit more inside than what can be observed from some objective behavioral standpoint. Is it even actually a kiss or a sign of affection? Is Ellen just putting her mouth to his to sort of perform something, or does she actually feel anything behind it? We aren't told. We're not given any perspective from her. She is, however, we are told, the initiator. He is passive, and you can read all sorts of character stuff into that as well. She is always essentially in control of her fate, or trying to exercise some control over her fate, and he is always just pathetically kind of going along with it, passively, weakly, honestly. The chapter ends on this image. After Archer, they get to Fifth Avenue and start getting close to the grandmother's house, and Archer says, well, okay, I gotta get out. And he decides he's gonna walk home. And then it ends on that image. The snow was over, and a tingling wind had sprung up that lashed his face as he stood gazing. Suddenly, he felt something stiff and cold on his lashes and perceived that he had been crying and that the wind had frozen his tears. The frozen tears. It is very melodramatic. It is a little on the cheesy side. It is a perfect little capstone to a plot-heavy romance novel. There's something very artificial about it, very again, sort of a performative thing. It's too obvious a metaphor that Wharton is tossing out there as a kind of just at the end to end a chapter gesture. So it's as if, like, look, now I'm writing a love story. It's fake, and that's probably the point. It is all performative, it is all fake, and it's just one more element of this fairly conventional narrative that is happening in a regular cadence of development and plot that is burying all of the angst that we saw in the first half of the novel bursting through. This part of the novel is squelching that. Those moments aren't breaking through with great regularity anymore. The melodrama is humming along, but the details are kept at a distance. We're given this grand, torturous reunion of the star-crossed lovers, but it's all seen through a kind of refracted lens. The hints of Archer's inner consciousness, his panicking at the loss of being, the loss of time, oh my God, I'm not making great use of this time. He's panicking at, why aren't we able to connect? What's happening here? Why can't we just run away from it all? All of these little fitful moments, fitful instincts are slowly being squelched down. They're not cracking through.